Welcome to the Deep Dive. If you think you know the story behind autism research, well, maybe think again. Today we're digging into some sources that offer a pretty sharp critique.
Yeah, it's not just about where things are heading now, but also looking back at the very roots of the field.
Exactly. We're tackling two connected issues. First, the lack of diversity in really big modern studies, and second, a historical figure who's been almost completely overlooked.
Right, our mission is to unpack the arguments from these sources. Why are major research projects, struggling to include diverse groups?
And how does that connect back to a history that might be, well, missing a key piece? A piece that maybe changes how we see the ethical beginnings of it all.
It's a powerful link because these two things kind of mirror each other, don't they?
They really do. We have this urgent need now for diverse studies, scientifically and ethically. But the fact that it's still such a problem seems weirdly tied to ignoring this forgotten pioneer.
Someone whose perspective was fundamentally different, more compassionate perhaps, than the commonly cited founders whose work emerged from, well, a more complex ethical time.
Okay, let's jump into the modern side first, this diversity gap. The sources really hammer this point about major research efforts, especially the big genetic ones.
Yeah, like the Spark study in the US, for example. Huge initiative, tens of thousands of people aiming to map the genetics of autism. It's ambitious.
Right?
But the participants, according to these critiques, are still overwhelmingly white. And this is despite the fact that we know autism diagnoses are rising among children of color.
So the participant pool just isn't matching the reality of who is being diagnosed today.
Pretty much. And that's not just like a small data quirk. It's a fundamental scientific problem.
How so? What's the actual consequence if, say, 90% of your genetic data comes from one group?
Well, you simply can't claim you understand autism fully, can you? The sources give a really concerning example. Yeah. Researchers are struggling to understand why Black autistic children seem to be diagnosed with co-occurring intellectual disability more often than white autistic children.
Right, I've heard about that disparity.
Is it biological? Or is it about delayed diagnosis, lack of access to early support, systemic biases in testing? We can't properly investigate with the current data.
Because the data reflecting the Black autistic experience isn't deep enough or representative enough to tease apart those factors.
Exactly. If the root causes are systemic, social factors, clinical bias studying mostly white populations isn't going to give us the answers needed for Black communities.
So if big projects like Spark know this is an issue, why isn't it fixing itself? Why aren't more diverse families signing up?
Well, the sources are really clear on this.
Yeah.
It won't just happen naturally. It takes way more than just, putting up a flyer with diverse faces on it.
It sounds like there's a deeper issue.
There is. Researchers have to grapple with the fact that many communities, especially communities of color, have very real, very justified reasons to distrust medical research.
Based on historical exploitation and neglect.
Precisely. Generations of it in some cases. So rebuilding that trust is paramount.
Okay, so what do the sources say needs to happen? How do you actually rebuild trust and get people involved?
It's about flipping the script, really. Instead of just asking communities for their data, the research initiatives need to show up and give back first.
Give back how?
By actively helping to expand access to diagnosis, to support services, right there in those underserved communities, making the benefits tangible and immediate.
So showing the research directly helps them, not just some far-off scientific goal.
Yes, and it requires real long-term engagement, led by people from the community, people who are trusted. It's relationship building, not just recruitment.
It needs to feel reciprocal, like a partnership, not just data extraction.
Absolutely. And for you, the listener, this matters because without this kind of outreach, the findings from these massive studies might only apply to a fraction of the autistic population.
We risk making health disparities worse, not better, and creating biased data for the future.
It's framed as both bad science and, frankly, an ethical failing.
Okay, so that modern problem, that lack of inclusion,
Yeah.
it leads us directly back into the history books, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It puts a spotlight on who we do include in the origin story.
It really does. The suggestion in these sources is that our standard history, the one often repeated, might be selective. Maybe it favors a simpler, more Western narrative.
One that maybe sidesteps some uncomfortable ethical questions about the accepted founders.
Potentially. And the biggest omission highlighted is Dr. Grunya Sukhareva.
A name I suspect many people haven't heard, even within the field sometimes.
Very likely. She's often missing from the standard historical overviews, even ones put out by major research groups. which is kind of wild given what she did.
So tell us, what's her story? Why is she so important?
Dr. Sukhareva was a Soviet child psychiatrist, and here's the kicker, the timeline. She published detailed clinical descriptions of children with autistic traits in the 1920s.
Wait, the 1920s?
Yep. We're talking detailed case studies, observations, published in Russian and German journals years, actually decades, before Leo Kanner's famous 1943 paper or Hans Asperger's main work around that same time.
Wow, that's nearly 20 years earlier than the names we usually associate with the discovery of autism.
It reframes the timeline significantly. The clinical recognition is much older than the standard narrative suggests.
So why? Why did her work coming out of the Soviet Union back then just vanish from the Western narrative?
It seems to be a mix of things. Obvious language barriers, for one. Her work wasn't widely translated or read in the US or UK.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then you layer on the political climate, the rising tensions, the path towards the Cold War. It created academic silos.
And probably a bias against Soviet science.
Almost certainly. Plus, let's be frank, the historical lack of recognition for women in science, especially those outside the established Western European and North American centers, it all sort of conspired to marginalize her contribution.
So a combination of language, politics, and sexism basically erased her from the mainstream history for decades.
That's the argument these sources make, and it forces us to look much more closely at the context of the founders we did elevate, Kanner and Asperger.
Right. Let's get into that ethical contrast.
Yeah.
If Sukhareva was working in the 20s with her approach, what was the backdrop for Kanner and Asperger in the 30s and 40s?
Well, their work emerged in a very different and frankly much darker context. It was deeply influenced by the eugenics movement that was powerful in Europe and America at the time.
The idea of improving the human race by controlling reproduction, eliminating undesirable traits.
Exactly. That ideology of racial hygiene and perfecting humanity. For Asperger, working in Vienna during the Nazi era, this wasn't just abstract theory. The perceived value or utility of a child, especially one with disabilities, could have life or death consequences.
An incredibly chilling context. So how did Sukhareva's environment in post-revolutionary Soviet Russia differ?
Dramatically. Now, Soviet society had its own immense problems, obviously, but the stated ideology after the revolution, at least in the early days, emphasized collective good, rebuilding, and finding value in all citizens, including those with disabilities or differences.
So the focus wasn't on filtering people out, but on finding a place for them.
Theoretically, yes. Her approach wasn't about identifying deficits to potentially eliminate them. It was about understanding the individual child, their unique strengths and needs. It was about integration and support.
How did that play out in her actual work with autistic children?
Her focus was on providing education, vocational training, finding ways for them to function and thrive within society. It was remarkably aligned with what we'd now call neurodiversity, understanding their specific ways of thinking and being, and supporting that.
So years before Kanner was framing autism in terms of emotional deficits or refrigerator mothers, Sukhareva was focused on strengths and societal integration.
That's the picture these sources paint. A focus on empathy, understanding, and support, contrasting sharply with the exclusionary, pathologizing, and eugenics-adjacent thinking influencing parts of the West.
The implication is huge. It's not just about historical accuracy. It's realizing there was this alternative, more humane foundation for autism research right from the start.
Exactly. And by largely ignoring Sukhareva, the field potentially cemented a different, perhaps more problematic legacy. Recognizing her offers a chance to learn from that different ethical starting point.
Which brings us right back to today. How does this historical correction connect to current research, especially the big genetic projects like Spark?
Well, the concern raised in these sources is that by not acknowledging Sukhareva and her integrationist approach, by implicitly sticking to the Kanner-Asperger lineage, these modern initiatives risk carrying forward some of that baggage.
Even unintentionally.
Even unintentionally. The worries about the direction of the research, particularly the intense focus on genetics.
Okay, tell us more about that. What's the specific concern tied to genetic mapping?
It's the potential endpoint of identifying autism genes. The sources raise serious alarms about the push towards developing prenatal screening tests.
Screening for autism before birth.
Yes, and the sources state this very starkly. This path could potentially lead to the systematic elimination of autistic individuals before they are even born.
Wow, that language is incredibly strong. It directly connects modern genetic research back to
the dark history of eugenics, as the sources put it. The argument is that Without a strong ethical framework centered on acceptance and valuing neurodiversity, the search for genetic causes can easily morph into a search for genetic solutions, which, in this context, could mean selective termination.
So the pursuit is framed as potentially prioritizing societal convenience or a narrow definition of normalcy over the lives of neurodivergent people.
That's the core of the critique. It questions whether the goal becomes preventing autism rather than supporting autistic people who are alive today and will be born in the future.
Given these profound ethical stakes, what are the sources demanding? What needs to change?
The call is for much greater transparency and accountability from research organizations. They can't just operate in a scientific bubble.
They need to talk openly about these implications.
Yes, and crucially, they need to genuinely involve autistic people in setting the agenda, not just as study subjects, but as partners and leaders shaping the research questions and priorities.
So centering autistic voices in the conversation about the future of autism research.
Absolutely. The demand is to challenge the narratives that implicitly or explicitly push for cures or genetic fixes over investing in acceptance, accommodation, and support for autistic people to live fulfilling lives right now.
It's a call to shift the focus, the funding, the entire ethical lens.
It really is. It's about deciding whether science serves to understand and support or potentially to devalue and eliminate a whole way of being human.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this. We've seen these two interconnected critiques.
Yeah. First, the urgent need to fix the diversity problem in current research for scientific validity and basic equity.
Right, actively engaging communities, building trust, making sure the research benefits everyone.
And second, the need to grapple with the history, to bring Sukhareva's compassionate integrationist approach back into the story, acknowledging the ethical complexities tied to Kanner and Asperger.
Because that history informs the present, especially when we look at the direction of genetic research.
Exactly. That fundamental tension seeking a cure versus advocating for acceptance and support, it's not abstract history. It's playing out right now. It's the ethical fault line.
Which leaves you, our listener, with this final thought to consider. When major research projects focus heavily on genetics, potentially echoing the exclusionary history by omitting the alternative Sukhareva represents, what does that say about whose lives, whose minds are truly valued in our society today? That's something to really think about.